Dobry вечір. Welcome to the Great Hall at the Cooper Union. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Adriana Farmiga, and in addition to being an artist, I am the acting dean in the School of Art here at Cooper, and a fellow Ukrainian. As you may know, the Cooper Union is among the nation's leading colleges for students pursuing degrees in art, architecture, and engineering. And since its founding, this institution has also stood as a public forum where individuals amplify calls for social justice, debate timely issues, and participate in the shaping of our shared human experience. We will continue in that tradition tonight. Tonight's conversation is meant to provide an opportunity to listen to the voices of Ukrainians as we mark 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion. Our guests will touch on topics that have affected them personally and whose dedication to scholarship, culture, justice, and activism mark them as the leading voices in the debate over how to understand this war. The conversation will focus on events of great importance for the contemporary world and should concern us all as actively engaged citizens. I am truly pleased that in this great hall, here at the Cooper Union, situated in our Little Ukraine neighborhood in the East Village of New York City, we have this forum for discussing these very difficult events in an open, respectful, and meaningful manner. I'd like to thank our partners in planning this event. First, the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US, which was established here in New York City in 1948. The Society's roots date back to 1873, when it was founded in Lviv as a scholarly association dedicated to the promotion of Ukrainian language, culture, and scholarship. Today, the organization has more than 400 members across the US and works to promote Ukrainian scholarship as well as research on Ukraine through publications, grants, and programming. Tonight's event is not our first collaboration with the Society. Some of you may remember the War Art Balance Roundtable, which took place here in April of last year. And if you missed it, please check out the YouTube channel that Cooper Union has to catch the replay. Next, I'd like to acknowledge the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, which has supported this event and lent its formidable organizational capacity. Since its founding in 1973, the Institute has promoted the advanced interdisciplinary study of Ukraine. And as its director, Serhiy Plokhy, has said, it has helped to put Ukrainian studies on the map of the world academic community. Today, that mission is more important than ever. The moderator of tonight's conversation is Dr. Oleksandra Matviichuk. Dr. Matviichuk is a professor of sociology at Reed College. She is well known for her pioneering work studying feminism, activism, and gender in contemporary Ukraine, and is a former president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. She is a full member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US and director of its History, Social Science, and Law section. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Matviichuk.
Thank you, Adriana. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here today, gathered for a cause that's so close to our hearts, understanding the war against Ukraine and what it will take for a lasting peace. I'm profoundly honored to share the stage today with several distinguished speakers as they reflect on and discuss the ongoing war against Ukraine. This war started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, the occupation of eastern regions of Ukraine, and the displacement of millions of Ukrainians from their homes. It's been 2 years since that fateful morning when, in the darkness before dawn, Russia bombed Kyiv and launched an unprovoked invasion of the rest of Ukraine. Those initial days were filled with fear and uncertainty, as the grim reality of a massive invasion of the country unfolded across cities, towns, and villages across Ukraine. The news painted a bleak picture of a swift and brutal conquest. 8 million Ukrainians fled their homes within the first weeks of the war, some forced to flee for the second time since 2014. Cities, towns, and villages were leveled by Russian bombs. In areas of Russian occupation, horrific atrocities occurred, including the forced deportation of nearly 20,000 Ukrainian children to Russia, children separated from their communities and families and forced to become Russian citizens. Bombings have devastated the country, damaging or destroying a tenth of the country's medical facilities, a significant share of its educational system, and much of its critical infrastructure. The ripple effects of this conflict have been felt worldwide. I'll just give one example. Russia's bombing of Black Sea ports and its blockade of grain exports via the Black Sea not only robs Ukrainian farming communities of the income they need to survive, it also exacerbates food insecurity in Africa and the Middle East, where the absence of affordable and abundant Ukrainian grain is keenly felt, as prior to 2022, 2/3 of imported grain originated in Ukraine. And these effects on the food supply are intensifying with each year. The total destruction of the Kakhovka Dam last spring not only deliberately inundated populated towns and villages, causing death and devastation and depriving hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians of access to clean water, it also triggered a massive and prolonged drought. This drought further endangers the next grain harvest, and the one after that, and the one after that. These and other actions by Russia have raised the price of food globally and are now affecting struggling communities, including those in the USA, where we're seeing heightened misery and distress. Despite the fears and the formidable challenges, the spirit of Ukraine has remained unbroken. Ukrainians have come together. The anticipated quick victory turned into a prolonged struggle for freedom and sovereignty, but at a terrible cost in human life. Please rise for a moment of silence to honor the victims of the war and to reflect on what will bring lasting peace to Ukraine. Thank you. You may be seated. As we move forward into tonight's program, we will be joined by several speakers who will help us to understand this war and what we can do to end it. Our first distinguished speaker will be Oleksandra Matviichuk, joining us remotely from Europe. Oleksandra is a lawyer and human rights activist in Ukraine who leads the Center for Civil Liberties, an organization that received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022 for its work protecting human rights and defending democracy in Ukraine. The Center for Civil Liberties has played a pivotal role in documenting atrocities committed during the war in preparation for international tribunals that we hope will hold Russia accountable. Their work has exposed the harsh realities Ukrainians face and the bravery of their response as they struggle together to survive. Her insights tonight promise to deepen our understanding of the resilience and strength of ordinary Ukrainians, as well as the failures of the international legal system to protect civilians. Following Oleksandra, we will have the pleasure of hearing from philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko. As a prolific writer and activist, as president of the writers' community PEN Ukraine, and through his influential English language podcast, Ukraine World, Volodymyr has been instrumental in keeping us in the West informed and engaged with the ongoing situation in Ukraine. His analyses offer a unique, philosophical, and deeply humanizing perspective on the resilience and resolve of the Ukrainian spirit in the face of colonialism and violence. Next, we will be joined by Kristina Hook, an American anthropologist and a fellow at the Atlantic Council. Kristina has done important work analyzing mass atrocities in Ukraine, important work that helps Ukrainians build understanding abroad for why they need international support. Today, she'll be sharing crucial details into how the mass atrocities of this war are perceived within and beyond the United States. Her perspective is invaluable in informing us of the role that international support can play in bringing lasting peace to Ukraine. Lastly, we welcome Christopher Atwood, a member of the advisory board for the Suspilnists Foundation, a Ukrainian nonprofit which supports young journalists, investigative journalism, and the public broadcasting system in Ukraine. Christopher's involvement in tonight's discussion will undoubtedly enrich our collective understanding of the current situation and the path forward. Before we begin, I would like to echo Adriana's heartfelt thanks to our partners and supporters, and I'd also like to thank Cooper Union, the Shevchenko Society USA, and Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. We also wish to thank the Polish Consulate General of the Republic of Poland in New York, represented tonight by Vice Consul Stanislav Staravsky. Special thanks as well to the Association for Slavic and East European Studies, Reed College, Grinnell College, Wesleyan University, and the the World's Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations for their support and commitment to bringing this event to life and for convening viewings and discussions of today's event throughout the country. And we must also thank our Ukrainian partners for the work they have done to make today's discussion possible. The Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties, the Ukraine World Podcast, PEN Ukraine, and the Suspilnists Foundation. As we engage with our speakers this evening, let us all reflect on the courage and resilience displayed by the people of Ukraine, the complexity of this conflict, and the crucial role we can play as witnesses and bystanders in supporting the enduring principles of sovereignty, peace, and justice. Please join me in welcoming Oleksandra Matviichuk to the stage.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. It's a huge honor for me to address to this distinguished audience. As a human rights lawyer, I have been documenting war crimes in this war which Russia started against Ukraine for 10 years already. Russian troops are destroying residential buildings, churches, museums, schools, and hospitals. They are shooting at the evacuation corridors. They are torturing people in filtration camps. They are forcibly taking Ukrainian children to Russia. They ban Ukrainian language and culture in the occupied territories. They are abducting, robbing, raping, and killing people there. And the entire UN architecture of international organizations and treaties can't stop it. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we have faced with unprecedented numbers of war crimes. We have joined our efforts with dozens of organizations in the different regions and built a national network of documentators throughout the country, including the occupied territories. We have an ambitious goal to document each criminal episode which was committed in a smaller settlement in each oblast of the country. And working together, we have already recorded and contributed over 64,000 episodes to our database. 64,000, it's a huge amount, but it's just a tip of iceberg, because Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. Russia tries to break people resistance and occupied territories with inflicting the immense pain on civilian population. And we documenting more than just violations of Geneva and Hague conventions. We document human pain, like in the story of 13-year-old boy Yelysey Rybakony. 2 years ago, when the large-scale war started, he, his mother, and his little 3-year-old brother were in Russian occupation in a village in Kiev Oblast. There was no electricity in the house. They had hardly any water and food. They were spending whole days in the cellar. His mother said that she addressed many bodies for the Russians to allow her to take her children to a safe place by car. They seemed to agree. Moreover, they even wave as if wishing them a happy journey. Nevertheless, While the family was leaving the village, the Russian military opened fire on civilians' cars in which there were women and children. The cars stopped, and people from them began to fall out onto the field. Yelisei was among those who died. The Russians forced the survived people to come back. At first, his mother wasn't allowed to take her son's body. Similarly, the Russians didn't allow burying their dead in the cemetery. The boy was buried in the garden near his house. The only thing left to his mother were her son's cap scratched by shrapnel and his white t-shirt, which they had put on his jacket to show that civilians were driving. There were no legitimate purpose in doing such thing. There were no military necessity in it. Russians have done these horrible things only because they could. This war started not in 2022, but in 2014. This was just after the Revolution of Dignity had ended in Ukraine. Millions of people had bravely stood up against a corrupt authoritarian regime. They took to the streets across the country, and they fought for the chance to build a state where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And when the authoritarian regime fell, Ukraine obtained a chance for the quick democratic transition. And in order to stop Ukraine progress towards genuine democracy, Russia invaded. Russia occupied Crimea and part of eastern regions in 2014, and then in 2022, it expanded this war into a full-scale invasion. Because Putin is not afraid of NATO, Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom. And that is why, when we talk about Russia's war against Ukraine, we are not talking about a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. Russia wants to convince the entire world that freedom, democracy, human rights, and rule of law are fake values because they do not protect anyone during the war. Russia wants to convince that a state with a strong military potential and nuclear weapon can break the world order, dictate its rules to international community, and even forcibly change internationally recognized borders. And if Russia succeeds, it will encourage other authoritarian leaders in the world to do the same. The international system of peace and security doesn't protect people anymore. This means that democratic governments will be forced to invest money not in education, healthcare, culture, or business development, not in solving global problems such as climate change or social inequality, but in weapons. We'll witness an increase in the number of nuclear states, the emergence of robotic armies, and new weapons of mass destruction. If Russia succeeds, and this scenario comes true, we'll find ourselves in a world that will be dangerous for everyone without any exception, because unpunished evil grows. Russian military committed terrible crimes in Chechnya, Moldova, Georgia, Syria, Mali, Libya, other countries of the world. They have never been punished for it. They believe they can do whatever they want. If we want to prevent wars in the future, we have to punish states and their leaders who start such wars. It's a common logic, because all these atrocities, which we now are documenting, it's results of the leadership decision to initiate, to plan, and to start the war of aggression. But in the whole history of humankind, we have only one precedent of punishment for the crime of aggression. It was Nuremberg trials. And we still look at the world through the lens of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi war criminals were tried only after the Nazi regime had collapsed. But we are living in a new century. Justice shouldn't depend on how and when this war will ends. Justice must not wait. The global approach to war crime justice must be changed. We must establish special tribunal now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and other war criminals accountable. When international community deal with wars, there is a great temptation to avoid solving difficult problems, hoping that they will just vanish. But the truth is that they only get worse. People in Ukraine want peace much more than anyone else. But peace doesn't come when the country which was invaded stops fighting. That's not peace, that's occupation. And occupation is just another form of war. People who live in peaceful cities sometimes think that let's stop this war, probably occupation is bad, but it's decrease the human suffering. But occupation is not about changing one state flag to another. The occupation means torture, sexual violence, enforced disappearances, ban of your identity, forcible adoption of your own children, filtration camps, and mass graves. People who live in occupation, they live in gray zone. They have no tools how to defend their rights, their freedoms, their property, and their beloved ones. Russia unleashed terror in the occupied territories to keep them under control. The Russian military exterminates local activists, mayors, public figures, journalists, volunteers, artists, priests. A week ago, Russians abducted and tortured to death a 59-year-old Father Stepan Podolchak, a priest of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. He was the head of church in occupied Kalanchak in Kherson Oblast. Russians abducted him from his home and took him away, barefooted and with a bag over his head, having turned his home upside down. And then, after 2 days, they told to his wife that Stepan Podolchak had a heart attack and passed away. But his wife and a lot of other people know that before this, Russians provide several interrogations of this Christian priest and push him to transfer his new built church and its congregation under the Moscow Patriarchate, which is controlled by Russian state. Father Stepan had refused, insisting that he wouldn't betray his oath nor his congregation. I told this story just to illustrate that we can't let people alone for torture and death in the occupied territories. People's lives can't be a political compromise. Calls for Ukraine to stop defending itself and to satisfy Russia's imperialist appetites are not just wrong because Putin will not stop. Such calls are immoral. We are approaching to the second anniversary of the large-scale war, and we are approaching the second anniversary in very difficult situation. Putin prepared to the long protective war, and only officially the 14% of Russian budget will be spent for military expenses. While the military support to Ukraine in the United States of America is blocked. Europe couldn't find a way how to close this back door, which helped Russia to bypass the sanctions and still import the Western technologies, which is critical to warfare. And recently, Putin was given opportunity to repeat again the genocidal calls in the interview, and he said that once again that Ukrainians do not exist and that Ukrainians are one people with Russians. It's not just words. This war has a genocidal character. All these years, we have been documenting how the Russian army implement these words in the occupied Ukrainian territories according to the principle that Ukrainians must be re-educated as Russians, and those who refuse to recognize the non-existence of the Ukrainian nation claimed by Putin must be exterminated. And that is why the Russian military tortures and kills Ukrainian writers, priests, and local self-government figures, ban the Ukrainian language and its history, destroy its cultural heritage, and forcibly deport Ukrainian children to Russia so they can bring them up as Russians. And that is why, to conclude my presentation, I would like to say that we have no other choice. We are fighting for freedom in all senses, for a freedom to have independent state and not to become a Russian colony, for a freedom to preserve Ukrainian identity and not to be forced to educate our children as Russians, and for a freedom to have our democratic choice, like a chance to build a country which we want. And if we stop fighting, there will be no more us. And that is why I still believe that the world will not stay just observer. Thank you.
It's very hard to follow a presentation like that, especially hearing from a lawyer and a human rights activist about the failures of law in this particular occasion. Let's start, I'd like to turn to Volodymyr, and if you could tell us a little bit about your projects since 2 years ago, especially the Ukraine World project. What has been your main reason that you are working in English, and what kinds of messages are you trying to share about the country at war?
Thank you, Oleksandra, and it's a huge honor to be here, frankly. It's not very often that I go abroad. I prefer staying in Ukraine. It's psychologically very difficult to go abroad, frankly speaking, because at the beginning of the invasion, I had the metaphor that for us, our country is a baby, in a sense that there is a feeling that you need to care about it and to do something to protect it. And as if you do something wrong, if you leave the country, if you don't do anything, then the baby dies. So I think this is a relationship between a citizen and a state, a citizen and a society, which is very, very strong and very interesting, because we understand that we individuals do not survive without our community, and the community do not survive without an individual. Oleksandra Matviichuk made a very powerful speech, and she's my close friend, and we talk very often together. And frankly speaking, I think that what we are trying to, many people in Ukraine are trying to do in different ways. Some people are on the front line as soldiers. Some others are volunteering to help the army. Me personally, with my wife, despite the fact that we are having 3 children, we go into the front line every month to help the military and to get information and to talk to people. And on Monday, we are on Friday, on Monday I was in Kherson. Kherson is a city, you probably know, that was occupied by the Russians for 8 months. And then when Ukrainians liberated the city, it was not the end of the horrible things, because Kherson is still under the Russian fire, under Russian artillery every day. Every day, so people tell us, okay, there will be 10 bombardments this day, there were 15 bombardments. And then there was the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam and the big flood. And for you to imagine, the water came in a certain districts of Kherson, came to the 2nd floor and stayed there for several weeks. And despite all that, occupation, shelling, flood, people are still strong. People are still strong, people are staying in the city, people are doing something, people are doing cultural works. When we bring libraries, when we bring books to the libraries, people are so enthusiastic about it. People smile. People don't ask you for anything. People don't ask you to, to give them something. People are really, really, really strong. And I do think that this strength and this resilience is something that is very valuable. I think that Ukrainian society can be described right now as a society of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And when I'm saying this, I'm not saying that Ukrainians are special. I'm saying this because I think that every society in such a circumstances will become like that. So we'll become a society that discovers strength despite difficulties, that discovers the willingness to leave despite the closeness of death. And I do think that we all need to understand, and Oleksandra is right when she's calling for the world to stand with Ukraine, to help Ukraine, and indeed we're fighting against a much bigger country with bigger resources. But it's not that we asking for this support. It's not because we are weak. I think it's because we are strong, we are resilient, we are ready to stand as long as we can. And for us, coming to your question, so why we try to talk so much in various languages? So Ukraine World is a multilingual website. We have 5 languages, not only English. And many other activists, journalists in Ukraine are trying to reach out to the wider world. I think this is because, obviously, that we are also trying to find our language and trying to, go against certain cliches which exist in the world. For example, there is a cliche that, that this is a war between Russia and the West, that this is a geopolitical war, and Ukrainians are just pawns and puppets, etc. Whereas we understand that in many aspects, Ukrainians persuade the wider world that we have the agency. We have the agency and we have the subjectivity, we have the capacity of action, which actually turns down many geopolitical interests. Like our relationship with the European Union is very special because now we have the candidate status to join the European Union, but it's not because the European Union was open to it. It's because Ukrainians were demanding so much and so much and so much. And another topic is, of course, this myth of the dividing lines in Ukraine and East and West. I'm here with a T-shirt which comes from Kharkiv. This is not an ordinary T-shirt. This is an audio waves reflecting the voice of Serhiy Zhadan, one of his poems. And the poem says, one of the lines says, "For 10 years I have been sewing the black sails of my ship." I think it's roughly this. So we are going to Kharkiv. I'm from Kiev. We are going to Kharkiv like every month. We are going to Kherson very often. South, east, center. It's all about plurality. It's all about multiplicity. Very interesting, very different. But at the same time, imagine Kharkiv is a city 40 kilometers from the Russian border. It is bombarded by the rockets S-300, and the thing about these rockets is that they first arrive and then you hear the air raid siren. With Kherson is even worse. And despite that, in Kharkiv there is a booming culture. There is amazing culture, maybe even stronger than it was before. So I do think that these stories should be told, the stories of resilience, the stories of, I always say that Ukraine is, during these circumstances, is a nation of despite. So we are doing things in despite of the limitations. We are pursuing freedom despite the situation when there is authoritarian empire which tries to destroy us for many, many centuries, right? We are trying to keep the humanity of the relations between people despite the fact that actually the war is something very inhumane. And I do think that this experience is not just experience about Ukrainians as a nation. It's a very human experience. It's a very universalistic experience. Therefore, this Ukrainian struggle actually, it tells us much more about human nature than we have thought previously.
Thank you so much. I'm really struck that you see this as kind of universal, because there's also a lot of special, I think, peculiarities of the Ukrainian response. I'm turning to Kharkiv, for example. Many, many years ago, in 1992, I was there for the first time, and at that time, people were very quiet, and they didn't tend to raise their voices, even in kind of defense of their own country. And in fact, one of the people I met there, when I explained that I was coming there from the United States and I was trying to learn about Ukrainian national identity, I met a young woman there who said, laughingly, "Oh, you want to know about Ukraine? You need to go out into the countryside. That's where you'll see Ukraine." And I was just really shocked by that. But at the same time, in Kherson, we see people today, rising up against some of these kinds of very extreme forms of violence. But it seems to me that kind of Kharkiv in the early 90s was a post-totalitarian situation. And people would often tell me that it wasn't any longer a natural thing for a Ukrainian to care. Like you were saying, that you think it's natural that you have this caring response. I actually think that maybe the revolution of dignity really changed Ukraine in terms of expanding their moral circle beyond, let's say, their families, beyond just like a few small, beyond the small inner circle that people trusted completely, but that was a very small number of people in their lives for whom they would care so deeply that they would be willing to take risks. But even in Kharkiv, I have to say, in 92, I was there on the anniversary of the Great October Revolution, and there was a really big group of people, and there was quite a ruckus. And the police were there kind of surrounding the great statue of Lenin that's been taken down recently by Euromaidan activists. And a lot of these people were Communist Party activists, and they were really, really aggressive. And the police held them back as this very distinguished elderly gentleman came along to bring his contribution for the Great October Revolution, which was a wreath made out of barbed wire. And the police held everyone back, and they wanted to rip it out of his hands, and he placed it at the feet of Lenin. And I thought at that moment that's a sign that even in Kharkiv, where people are so hesitant to go beyond their own immediate families, where this young Russian woman who was of Russian ethnicity felt that the city was a Russian city, and that was her city, and that Ukraine started somewhere out there in the countryside. I could see already then that people were starting to change, but it struck me that it was really a very far distance from the reaction that I'm seeing since 2014.
So it's very interesting how you can look at this society from the sociological point of view, from the value point of view, how this idea of care and agency actually enlarges. So I do agree with you that there is a big part of citizens in Ukraine. I would say that the feeling of my things.
The widening of the moral circle.
Yes, the feeling was restricted with the idea of yourself and your family, and they have been perceiving society as basically atomistic war of all against all. And I agree with you that this is an effect of the totalitarian society. So this is an effect of what Hannah Arendt would say, that totalitarianism is about loneliness, the existential loneliness, and therefore when people do not feel themselves parts of your community, and they feel that they are lonely, and therefore they need some structure over them to bring them together, because they cannot bring together horizontally. And I do think I have a hypothesis that Russia is currently structured like that. So of course you have like elements of that in Ukraine as well, we cannot deny it. But it is really changing. One story about Kharkiv I can tell you. So we bring in cars to the front line, to the soldiers. Soldiers need cars because evacuation car, for example, that evacuates the wounded soldiers from the front line, it can be destroyed like a week after we bring it. So we buy cars in Europe, we bring it to Kyiv, then we bring it to the front line. And our trip was first to Kharkiv, because we had good events there and brought some foreigners, including, by the way, a very interesting and prominent American writer, David Reef, who was with us. And on our way back from Izum is a place where one of the biggest mass graves is located. So in a forest, when you enter Izum is a city in Kharkiv Oblast, which was occupied by the Russians for about 6 months, and which was heavily bombarded. And one of the crimes we are following personally is when Russians bombarded the big residential house, and we personally talked to a man who lost 7 members of his family in 1 second, including three grandchildren. And even the more horrible thing is that, well, I cannot say more horrible. Well, another part of this horrific thing is that the bodies of these people were lying under the rubble for over the months because the fights were going on, and Russian occupation forces were not really caring about taking these bodies away. But that's one of these very difficult stories. So we talked to people, and then we were coming back to Kharkiv. And in Kharkiv, we realized that our car was broken. And it was Saturday night. And we were supposed on Sunday morning to go to Kherson, which is 8 hours drive. So we were looking for people who would fix our car, and we finally found them. And they were working during the night from Saturday to Sunday, and then the whole Sunday until 7 p.m., and they fixed the car. They didn't take any money from us. This is what I would call, this texture of solidarity, because everybody understands, yeah, this is important thing. Our soldiers need assistance on the front line. So you finally realize that this is the moment when you realize you're not alone, right? Because there are people around whom you don't know, they are not aware of your existence. Like 5 minutes ago, they were not aware of your existence, and then they will spend the whole day of helping you fix the car for the soldiers. So I do think this is changing. I think you're right when you say that Revolution of Dignity was one of these turning points. I think we can talk about the Orange Revolution as well.
Absolutely.
In 2004, 2005. I think this was a gradual process, and I think the first revolution on granite in 1990, then Orange Revolution, they were kind of creating this feelingness of glue between people, between communities. And actually, when the war started in 2014 and full-scale invasion, it's only increased this feeling. I'm not saying that Ukraine is a society with no divisions, absolutely solidarity, etc. No, there are lots of internal divisions like in any society, and of course in a society which is painful, which is traumatized by the war, there are new divisions, the divisions of experience, the divisions of action, etc. But this idea that you enlarge the borders, moral circle, it's there.
Yeah, no, we see much evidence of the enlargement of the moral circle, and I think it's something very special, and therefore we want to really center the stories of the people who have done so much to initiate that. And I know that in many regards, actually, you've been a steward of those kinds of projects. So I think maybe, Kristina, you have something that you could share about how you, from your own project, have observed the way the war is seen, maybe perhaps starting from the American perspective. I know that you do a lot of work with human rights institutes and bring attention to not just human rights atrocities in Ukraine, but in other countries. Could you give us a little bit of an idea of like what you encounter as like American understandings of this particular war?
Thank you for that, and thank you for having me, and thank you to each of you for coming, for, I think, demonstrating your solidarity not only with Ukraine and Ukrainians, but I think also global atrocity victims. It's a kind of both and leaning into process. And so, I have the sort of challenging job for an anthropologist where we love to be in the details to sort of go big picture, and to think, what are the sort of big stories out there that maybe are being pushed in the media that aren't wrong, but that might divert our attention or draw our attention to only specific things. And so for me, when I look around, I think that most people know there's a war going on. I'm really grateful as someone, again, who cares about Ukraine, who cares about atrocity victims, to see that care. But if people know that there's a war going on, do they understand the level of totalizing daily atrocities? And do they understand how rare Russia's extensive atrocities are in the global context of war? And for our leaders in particular, are they building their policies on the ground dynamics we're actually seeing, or perhaps the ground dynamics they wish they were seeing? And that leads us into some problematic areas, because I would say that every wrong call that I have seen from international observers over the last 2 years, from calling on Ukrainians to stop resisting, to calling on Ukrainians to give up their land or their people, or to calling on countries like mine to stop providing the tools to defend themselves, every wrong call has one thing in common, and that's downplaying the nature of Russia's atrocities and what those atrocities are actually telling us about Russia's strategy, what their aim is. And so, I'm here as a professor of conflict studies, specializing in atrocities and in genocide, and I can point out that there are 3 things that are commonly said that we just don't have data for. And so there are 3 perceptions about this war that I think are wrong: that the war is a territorial or a border dispute, that a ceasefire would bring peace and safety, and that Russia's atrocities in Ukraine are somehow just inherent to the tragedy of warfare. And I'd like to start with the last one first because it's really damaging and it's really wrong. Atrocities are not common in warfare. We know from the research in my field that not all armed conflicts result in mass atrocity crimes against the civilian population. We also have research showing that most armed groups, even when they have both the opportunity and the ability to inflict atrocities against civilians, they choose not to. And so that is why big databases like the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and my good colleagues there, when they're talking about definitions like mass killing, they're using language to look at crimes that have killed what they call 1,000 non-combatant deaths along some type of group line in a year. 1,000 civilians, 1,000 people. And that's terrible, that's terrible. But when we look at what Russia has done in Ukraine, I don't even quote the sort of UN numbers because it's such a low undercount. We know that something around 18% of Ukraine is occupied by the people inflicting this violence. And so we don't have the numbers from those areas. And I also want to point out, too, that people are not numbers. But when we do look at the numbers, the way that civilian casualties in war are counted will never include the full picture in Ukraine. They'll never include things like elderly citizens who lived in frontline areas and who had stress-related heart attacks due to shelling, or who died of preventable diseases that were caused by Russia's war against Ukraine. And those types of numbers will never pick up the emerging reports we have of teenage heart attacks in Ukraine. But even with all of those limitations, the numbers we have are so much higher than the way that the US Holocaust Memorial Museum would talk about a mass killing. And so for me, that's really important because I think that that's being downplayed. And when we talk about not all armed conflicts resulting in mass atrocities against civilians, we have to face the truth of what Russia is doing in Ukraine and what they're doing to the Ukrainian people. And we have to stop cloaking a kind of lack of courage in this language of a ceasefire, which would simply strip these victims of their ability to respond and to protect themselves from something very unusual that is being done to them. And so what is Russia actually doing in Ukraine? Why is it not a territorial war? I'm just going to echo some of the points that my fellow speakers have said, some things that are just pieces of the puzzle, but that are really important. When Russia and its proxy forces had committed thousands of war crimes in eastern Ukraine prior to 2022, I would argue that it is undeniable that attacking the people of Ukraine, Ukrainian society, and Ukrainian identity were part of the plan from the earliest days of 2022. That we have seen the targeting of influential Ukrainians across a variety of community roles, and not just military, not just political leaders, not just police officers, but also teachers. That we have also seen this extreme, barbaric violence of rape, torture, killing, and trafficking directed at Ukrainian children, women, and men across a series of facilities and camps. And what is very important for me in some of the work that I've done with Christopher here is that we saw these similar patterns across every area that Russia has controlled, and that is telling us something important about the level of pre-planning, the level of coordination, and premeditation. And this has a human face. It's not just patterns, it's humans. So we've seen cities razed to the ground, churches, museums, theaters, artistic sites shelled and bombed, apartment complexes targeted. We've seen atrocity perpetrators rewarded after the fact. We've seen reconnaissance of hospitals and military and maternity wards where what the purpose of that building was confirmed by the Russian side, and then it was targeted. And we've also documented again that this is just systematic, that it is just a sort of machine of atrocities. And so we have to face the sort of truth in front of our faces. And I would say that the only way that you can call that a border dispute is if you ignore 95% of the data in front of your face. That this is a war, yes, but for me, and I mean this very clinically, in a sort of international law way, that it is a genocide, that it is this machine of willful destruction that is along group lines with specific intent. And what is very disturbing for me, and I'd like to take this opportunity with a microphone in my hand to say, is that we argue in the type of work that I do that we're seeing this escalate by the Kremlin, by Russian actors, by Putin himself, as his confidence in their ability to get away with these crimes, their behavior escalates. And I'll wrap up. I don't want to hog the microphone, but I do want to say one thing. And that is that I kind of lose my words sometimes when I'm trying to describe how devastating this is for the Ukrainian people, despite their incredible creativity and courage and talent. But I need to find my words tonight because I need to describe how equally devastating this is for us, for my fellow Americans, for the rest of the world, for everyone here at the Cooper Union and online, and for everyone that also cares about global atrocity victims. And I need to describe how Russia's unrelenting pursuit of getting away with these type of gravest crimes is changing the world in front of our eyes in very negative ways. And so when we go back to the sort of calamities of prior generations and why we decided that we needed law to protect the dignity of human beings. The sort of firstborn of international law was the Nuremberg period that Oleksandra talked about, and it was the Genocide Convention, that we have lots of different types of international law now, but this was the sort of firstborn. And so we can critique the convention all day long. I certainly do. If my students are watching, they know that. But it was the sort of firstborn to protect the dignity of individuals in big countries and small. And so we need to consider our failures of obligation in that way every day that Ukrainians are being bombed and targeted with no daily international corresponding actions that seek to, on a sort of case-by-case, event-by-event basis, deter Russia from these type of atrocities. And we need to consider the way that Ukraine in the global conversation is chiseling away at our human rights foundations and how this is also affecting our ability to protect and uphold the dignity of Ukrainians and other global atrocity crime victims. And so as I kind of wrap up, I want to point out one other dimension that this is so extremely rare, and we need to kind of sit with these unusual features and these rarities of this case of what Russia is doing in Ukraine that has global impacts. And that is that Russia has launched an international war of aggression. And by that I mean they launched what is kind of in a legally dry and technocratic way, an unprovoked invasion on a neighboring country with the specific desire to encroach upon and to destroy their neighbor's sovereignty and their territorial integrity. And again, this is very rare. So in my field, after the 1990s, after the kind of rough period of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we saw conflict dynamics shift. This is a well-known thing in our field that we saw that instead of having state-on-state or country-on-country war, it kind of shifted primarily after the 1990s to civil wars, to interstate conflict. In 2004, for example, not a single country-on-country war was recorded. And so what Russia has actually done beginning in 2014 and escalating in 2022 is to open this deadly Pandora's box with a crime of a one-sided, unprovoked military aggression against their neighbor. And again, that puts us all at risk. And so I just want to kind of describe that, like, if God forbid what Russia has done in Ukraine would happen to countries big or small, these are just a few of the things that it would mean. It would mean losing the right to speak your language, to choose your faith, to live in physical safety where you don't have to take certain steps to disguise your appearance to sort of de-incentivize you being raped, where you don't have to ask for your friends to burn off simple tattoos that demonstrate that you love your country or your identity, because of course that's what we saw in occupied Kherson, where that was enough to single people out for violence by Russian occupiers. And of course, like, that would mean not losing thousands and thousands of your children and your adults to criminals who are doing their best to hide them from you. That is the human toll of a one-sided war of aggression where Ukraine, a country that has never attacked Russia, could still be violated in these most horrific ways imaginable. And so what that means is that people in big countries and small countries absolutely lose alongside Ukraine if Russia proves that this invasion and atrocities formula is a winning strategy, that these kind of basic international rules, while often violated, were themselves not called into question, and that's what's at stake here. And so for someone like me who looks a lot for people around the world who could be targeted, this is extremely concerning, and it's something that would just kind of call into question all of our ability to protect people around the world along with Ukrainians. And so I just wanted, the last thing I'll say is that these are kind of big, dark pictures, but we are never powerless. And it's funny that you said ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because I think for me, as someone who's been living in Ukraine for almost a decade now, I saw that a lot, not just after 2022. And it's something that I think a lot about today as well. And so as we, as kind of ordinary people in this room, think about what we can do against great evil, it's going to begin with small steps.
Thank you so much. There's so much that I can respond to there. It strikes me that an important misconception that a lot of Americans hold is that that the Russian state is actually involved institutionally in carrying out these atrocities. And I think I'll just give one example that I think the media often portrayed sexual violence in the context of this war as a primarily interpersonal kind of act, as something that like young drunken soldiers would engage in, almost as if it was something that was ancillary to the actual conflict. And this is actually a very common misconception, but in some wars, sexual violence isn't used systematically. I know that the work that Oleksandra Matviichuk and her center has done alongside other human rights organizations in cataloging the sexual violence committed since 2014 is really eye-opening in this regard. The vast majority of the sexual violence that was carried out against Ukrainians, both soldiers and civilians, was carried out in detention centers and was involving Russian state military intelligence officers using a playbook of torture methods that were used ubiquitously throughout these detention centers. And sexual violence was very central to that. It's been documented and according to their reports, as many as 10 to 20% of detainees were subjected to sexual violence in some form. And I think that a lot of the media perceptions that we had in the especially first months of this war really highlight that sexual violence was occurring in this war, but they made it seem as if it happened in like someone's backyard or in someone's house. Whereas in this case, it's really important for us to kind of understand that that there's an institutional sort of system, institutionalized system of warfare that's being carried out. And actually, this is a good segue to talking about the work of writers and how writers in Ukraine have been trying to change the way that Ukrainians view their own country and the problems within Ukraine. A long time ago, Oksana Zabushko wrote a book called Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, very controversial. And I read it very carefully because I thought it was really perceptive. And what I noticed was that she cataloged a lot of forms of sexual violence and sexual humiliation that were carried out by gatekeepers of institutions, that were carried out by civil servants, that were carried out by people who were abusing their position of authority. And that actually had something to do with the way the totalitarian system operated. And it makes me think that with Oksana and her generation, there was the beginnings of a new kind of confessional approach to telling people's lives and telling the truth of their lives. That in some respects, I found people, at least in the past, especially older people, they found this very uncomfortable, and they found it very uncomfortable to read her books for various reasons. Volodymyr, could you tell us a little bit about how younger writers are struggling against some of the taboos? And I would say one of the things that people would tell me about Zabushko's work is that she talked about sides of life that they felt ashamed about. And so they didn't want people to be dignifying something by putting it inside of a book. So they thought of the books as something elevated, and not something that would explore the sort of aspects of people's lives that were abusive or unpleasant.
I think that one of the strengths of the Ukrainian literature today is extreme realism. So in a way, we have nowhere to hide. And first, let me say that a big number of the Ukrainian writers are actually became soldiers. So when we are talking about the war, and sometimes we kind of divide between, okay, there are acts of atrocities against civilians, as if the very act of aggression is not a crime, because a big part of the Ukrainian army are actually former civilians. And there are several of my friends who are on the front line, and men and women, who are great writers and who are very young. I can quote several names. I can quote Yarina Chernoguls, who has been my student at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in philology department. And if you are interested, I have a podcast with her precisely on explaining Ukraine on Ukraine World.
This is actually a good moment for me to put in a plug for the podcasts. They're really good. You should spend the rest of the next 6 months listening to them.
Well,
That's what I've been doing.
I hope not the rest of your lives. But there is Artur Dron, who has in his early 20s, and he is a remarkable poet, very young. But there are cases which are sad. That we recently said farewell to Maxim Krivtsov, who is a young poet who just published his first book, poetry book, and who was on the front line, a soldier, and he was killed.
Victoria.
Of course, one of these stories is very dear to us, is Victoria Melina, who was killed in Kramatorsk in June 27th last year, in a place where we actually visited many times. It's a restaurant in Kramatorsk. Kramatorsk is a city 40 kilometers from the front line. And Victoria, I do hope that her work will be known much more right now. But Victoria is a civilian, and she was documenting war crimes in a way that Oleksandra and her team is doing. And her poetry, I just came up with an idea, because our connection was, I didn't know her for a long time. We started really communicating together because of this full-scale invasion. We traveled to Kharkiv together, we traveled to Kherson together. And in Kyiv we have a format of musical poetical performances, and I was playing the piano several times when she was reading poetries. So I actually practically remember many of her poems. And I said to myself, look, this is something new. This is not a typical poem, because I would say that this is documentary poem. So in a way that she would go to people and ask her testimonies, which are very often very, very hard. In some cases, there are testimonies of violence and of sexual violence and others. And lots of women's stories. And these are not just the product of imagination. This is not a poetry that that is just creating from the imagination. This is a poetry which is deeply rooted into the reality, which is also testifying. And being a witness, I think many Ukrainian writers have this feeling that their task today is being a witness.
And this is a very hard role, and I think this is also an illustration of the expansion of the moral circle, because if you look at the poems written by the late 80s poetry, a lot of it was very narrowly defined and very introspective, and I think people were trying to escape engagement with the outside world. They felt like the engagement with the outside world was, in some sense, traumatic to them and to their development. And here we're seeing that there's the expression now of this ability to take on all of that pain in addition to your own pain and try to make something creative out of it. And it does suggest to me that people are placing the moral circle further and further and further outside of themselves.
Yes, and for example, the story of Victoria is connected to the story of another Ukrainian writer, Volodymyr Yermolenko, who was precisely living in Izum, and he is a victim of Russian atrocity, because this is a story when he was kidnapped with his son, who is having autistic spectrum, and then he was brought back, then he was kidnapped again, and then they did not return him back, and his body was found next to the road, and then in this common grave in Izum. And Victoria was somebody who was searching for his diary, and she found this diary by digging the land where he dug this diary, and said to his father that I dug this diary here. So she came to this home, she found this diary in the land, and this is another story how Ukrainians are connected to the land, to the earth,
and to each other.
And to each other. And she wrote a preface to this diary. We published this diary in Pan Ukraine, and the mystical story is that, well, the missile strike in Kramatorsk was on 27th of June, and she passed away in Dnipro.
And it's important for us to recognize that people see it as a deliberate strike on a restaurant.
Yes.
Not on a military installation.
Yes, this is a pattern of Russian atrocities. They really target crowds of people. I can talk about this a little bit later if you want. But she passed away on the 1st July, which is Vakulenko's birthday. So there is a deep connection between these two writers who were not connected during their peaceful life. There are other writers like Boris Gumenyuk, who is a very powerful poet and who is considered to be missing on the front line. So and his poems are very, very powerful and very, very honest and very, very direct. So I think that the concept of honesty right now plays a huge role. So it's not a time for play. It's not a time for imitation, and this situation brings it to a very high level of this. And like many poets who are my friends, and we're talking. Although I'm not a poet, I'm a philosopher, but we really make a community, like a big family. People like, the names you should really discover is people like Katarina Kalitko or Irina Tsilik or Yulia Musakovska.
A great idea for our next event.
Yeah, we should be reading poetry, yes. So I think there is something going on very, very profound here. I think there is in Ukrainian culture, in literature, in theater, in cinema, there is going on something very profound, because it is always about this meeting with death and meeting with the end of life, but life itself becomes so intense and felt in such an intense way that it's really very powerful.
I'm struck that I heard recently a poet also say that the only subject that Ukrainian writers write about is death.
No, I would disagree. I think the key subject is life despite death. So it's a very different thing, and I think this is a feeling of intensified feeling of life at a point where you know that it can end at any point.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, a lot of these new young writers have been building new publics, and they don't just write books. They travel like you do, and actually you're involved in also the creation of new communities, of bringing people into events that they can feel the living voice of the people who are creating, and also feel the sense of community that's created by the sharing of these stories and this testament. It's important for us to also think about the role that journalists play in this, and I was thinking, Christopher, you might speak about the Suspilnost Foundation.
Sure. So first of all, thank you to all of our partners with Cooper Union for hosting this kind of an event. It's incredibly critical to have these conversations. When we talk about the Suspilnost Foundation, it's one of the oldest civil society foundations in independent Ukraine. They're turning 30 next year. And really, in like 2 words, the idea of the foundation is to empower young journalists to build a civil society, because independent quality press is critical to a democratic society. And I think that I view Suspilnost as, and I view the work of the journalists who've created that organization as a representation of the civil society that has been built in Ukraine that has led to the resistance that we have seen. We've heard from Volodymyr about Kharkiv, about Kherson, and about how it's a collective resistance of understanding who you are and understanding, ultimately that the values that we in America espouse and believe in, these are values that Ukrainians have to fight for, because if they do not fight for them, then there's occupation, and as Oleksandra Matviichuk said brilliantly in her speech, occupation is just another form of war. And so when Volodymyr was talking about Kherson, I remembered a song from a Ukrainian rap project called Palindrom, called Kherson. And it kind of reflects a shift in the way that Ukrainians, particularly in places like Kherson and Kharkiv, have understood their role. There's a line in the song that says, I don't want to go to Europe, I am Europe. And the song is written from the perspective of Kherson. And this is a song about a city that at the time was under occupation and was soon after liberated. And the understanding of people living under occupation, no. We are Europe. We are defending the values that Europe represents. We are defending the values that we must defend in order to survive. And that all comes back full circle to kind of the need to build these institutions, the role of journalists in Ukraine. So many civil society leaders in Ukraine got their start as journalists. Svetlana Zelishuk was a brilliant journalist who took part in the Maidan Revolution, became a member of parliament, became an advisor to the prime minister. And this is one of the strengths of Ukrainian civil society. And so organizations like Suspilnost are they're the ones who laid the groundwork for all the resistance that we see to really have the impact that it does.
It's extremely important. I'm glad that you brought up the idea that they're laying the groundwork for what we've just been talking about, which is we have the poetry and writing of testimony, of documenting. We have the human rights work of documenting war crimes. We have writers documenting war crimes. We have journalists writing about that. abundant information, abundant data about the atrocities that have been committed. Maybe we could spend the last few minutes kind of imagining a better world, and like what would it take for the world to not allow these kinds of things to happen. I know that you both have been working with trying to apply the Genocide Convention as a framework for responding to military aggression. Would you guys like to just very briefly explore that, because it's something that I think we can draw to a close on?
Sure, so I'll start off and then hand it over.
But remember, we actually only have a few minutes.
Right. So I think I'll just connect it to something that you said, Alex. You were talking about sexual violence, and so that's something, that's a part of it. And I think I'll go big picture and then small. So when we're looking at it with this type of genocidal violence, which is a crime that you prove the intent to destroy in whole or in part. So when you're looking at sexual violence as a piece of that puzzle, we pay really close attention to the fact that the patterns are just eerily, uncoincidentally similar across every area of Ukraine that Russians could get to. But we also look at these kind of like very intimate patterns of that violence, and I have permission to share this story from the Kyiv region, so I will. And there is, just one particular story that's telling us something large and important. This woman, her husband was killed right away by Russian soldiers coming to their home. And they heard her trying to soothe their infant child, who even as a child had just had his father murdered in front of him. And she was singing to the child this ancient Ukrainian lullaby. And this enraged the Russian soldiers, who then proceeded to rape her to teach her Russian and to work the Ukrainian out of her. And so that, again, is not just the big picture about these uncoincidental patterns that indicate premeditation, but it's also specific testimony like that, because we have perpetrators who, in my experience, are incredibly open about what they're doing and why, because they think they're going to get away with it. And so that's what we're kind of looking at. Christopher, do you want to take on some of the...
For sure. I think that in the work that Kristina and I have done, one of the these kinds of stories pop up over and over and over when we last year wrote a report on Russia's violations of the Genocide Convention together, and at one point we had to have a phone call where we said we have to stop collecting sources because there's too much, there's too big of a pattern, there are too many anecdotes to include, including beating a woman and soldiers telling her that they're going to beat the Ukrainian out of her. And I think there's a misconception of, to Kristina's earlier remarks, there is this misconception that we don't have the tools to deal with a war of aggression, and we do. And one of those tools is the Genocide Convention. This is not just a war. This is not just a territorial dispute. This is an attempt to erase an identity and to remove a group from a territory in order to establish a new national group that reflects the invading country. And I don't think that we can overlook the fact that we literally do have the tools. We just need to use them.
That is actually a big but, though. I mean, we have really good international laws, but there's no way to implement them. And unfortunately, some of these patterns that we've seen in Ukraine, I mean, Russian soldiers have engaged in these kinds of atrocities in many other contexts, and the Russian state has never been held accountable, and the Russian state doesn't intend to be held accountable. So it does seem like there's a sort of way in which Russia has developed its leverage within the international system through its power, through its status as a successor state to the Soviet Union, and exploited that, preventing many of these human rights mechanisms from operating.
I can say just one thing off of that, because we talk about
1 minute for each
where
of you.
Where is the enforcement mechanism? This is a very special room because the enforcement mechanism for international law is you. So, if it's domestic law, you have police, they enforce it. With international law, it's public pressure. It's reminding, for example, if you're an American, that we have ratified the Genocide Convention, which means we've legally obligated ourselves to. Ask your elected representatives, ask journalists to ask them what they're doing in response to that. So I would say that we do have an enforcement mechanism and that every one of you are it.
It's very difficult to squeeze a big thought in 1 minute, but I will try. I think that why we should care all about this. I think what is going on right now is that Russian society and Russian state is a state that actually is weak because the only thing of influence, both its citizens and countries, which are foreign countries, is violence. So it's a huge story which comes from the Russian Empire, which comes through the Soviet Union, which comes to the Putinist age, and a statement that basically violence is the only tool. The only tool to make policy, the only tool to connect with other countries. So the story of Russia and Ukraine is a story when Russia tried to subjugate Ukraine in different ways, through the soft power, through propaganda, through internal agents, and it didn't work. And finally they said, okay, if it doesn't work, we will go, and by the way, the sexual violence is a very important metaphor for them because they describe this war as an act of political or geopolitical sexual violence, if you listen to them. Yes. And for us, for all of the international community, it's a very important to understand that, yeah, we have tried since the World War II to build an international community based upon the idea that rules will prevail and not violence. It didn't work, probably ideally, not in many cases. There are many, many violations, but still the idea was there. What is now going on is that Russia is actually persuading everybody that violence is the only tool of influence. And if it succeeds in Ukraine, that will mean that we will enter a new normality. And we will enter the new normality where everywhere in the world, both in geopolitics, foreign policy, and in domestic policy, people will say, yeah, violence is the only argument. And that's very dangerous.
So to quickly add to that, effectively this means that, as Kristina said, all of us citizens of the world, we have the ability to pressure our representatives to do something, but also this is effectively, the invasion of Ukraine is effectively, it will ultimately decide the future of our geopolitical order. Either we're going to pursue an order where violence is bad, and we avoid violence and we appreciate democracy, or we're going to have an international order that violence is good and authoritarian rules. And so it's up to all of us to take part in that struggle, and that's why I always believe, and I always tell all of my friends, family, and colleagues that the Ukrainian struggle is also our struggle, and it's our duty to do everything we can to support Ukraine.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Kristina, and thank you, Volodymyr, for a wonderful discussion about a very horrible thing. Thank you.